All right, we're about to dive into one of the most charged and misunderstood topics out there, the IQ gap. We're going to unpack why we see these persistent differences in average IQ scores between groups. And let me tell you, to get to the bottom of it, we have to navigate a real minefield of history, some seriously flawed science, and some pretty profound social questions.
So let's just get right to it. Why do these average scores differ? Well, the answer is anything but simple. It's a story that actually starts more than a century ago with a really dangerous idea. And to have any hope of understanding the science today, you've got to understand that history first. They're completely intertwined.
So, here's our game plan. First, we're going to establish why this question even matters so much. Then, we'll dig into the dark origins of IQ testing in the eugenics movement. After that, we'll look at the powerful modern evidence for environmental factors, break down some key scientific concepts that always get twisted, and finally, we'll land on what the scientific consensus is today.
Okay, let's kick things off with part one, the IQ gap question. Before we get into any of the nitty-gritty science, we really need to understand the stakes. Why has this been such a fiery debate for over 100 years?
Well, it matters because, for better or worse, these scores aren't just some numbers on a page. Decades and decades of research have shown they're strongly connected to really important things in life, like what kind of job you get, how much you earn, even your overall health. And the central problem, the tension that fuels this whole controversy, is that we see these persistent average differences between different socioeconomic and racial groups. And that's a finding that demands a really rigorous, careful explanation.
Which brings us right to the history in our second section. The very first explanation that was ever offered for these gaps is what's known as the hereditarian thesis. And, well, it was born out of a deeply, deeply disturbing movement.
You really can't separate the story of IQ testing from the eugenics movement. The story picks up steam in 1909. In France, a psychologist named Alfred Binet creates a test with a really noble goal, to find kids who needed a little extra help in school. But when that test was brought over to the United States by people like Henry Goddard, its entire purpose got twisted. It was weaponized, used to label people as feeble-minded, which then paved the way for the Army's massive sorting tests, and ultimately led to something horrifying, the Supreme Court of the United States actually approving forced sterilizations.
And what's really wild is how clear the original creator, Binet, was about this. He basically said, look, we have to fight against this pessimistic idea of branding a child for life. He never, ever wanted his scale to be a permanent label. But in the US, eugenicists like Goddard just flat out ignored him. They took his tool and perverted it to create this rigid ranking of what they called immutable intelligence, even coming up with the word moron to label people they wanted to marginalize.
Then, this whole ideology got supercharged during World War I. The U.S. Army gave its alpha and beta tests to 1.75 million recruits. But these tests weren't really measuring some kind of raw, innate intelligence. I mean, a lot of the questions were basically a pop quiz on the culture of wealthy, white, urban America at the time. So, surprise, surprise, the results proved that Northern Europeans were superior. And here's the kicker. This deeply flawed, culturally biased model, it became the blueprint for many of the standardized tests we still use today.
And this wasn't just some abstract academic debate. The real-world consequences were devastating. I mean, look at this quote. This isn't from some extremist newsletter. It's from a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, in the majority opinion for Buck v. Bell. That decision made it legal to forcibly sterilize a woman named Carrie Buck, all based on the evidence from these IQ tests. It's just a chilling reminder of how deeply embedded these ideas were at the highest levels of power.
Okay, so that is the dark history of the hereditarian view. But that's only half the story. So let's pivot to part 3 and look at the power of the environment, where the scientific evidence tells a powerful counter-narrative.
Now, if group differences were mainly driven by genetics, you really wouldn't expect the environment to have this big of an impact. But it absolutely does. A standard deviation is just a way statisticians measure how spread out data is. And check this out. Studies show a massive gap of 0.65 standard deviations in IQ scores between kids from high and low socioeconomic families. To give you some context, that is a huge effect. It's comparable to about half of the entire black-white achievement gap in the US.
And the evidence gets even more specific and pretty stunning. A huge analysis of nutritional studies found that severe iodine deficiency, which is a completely preventable environmental problem, can cause an average loss of 13.5 IQ points. Just let that sink in for a second. That one single fixable factor can account for almost the entire 15-point gap that is so often the entire focus of this debate.
And it's not just iodine, not by a long shot. We also have to factor in huge disparities in things like healthcare and prenatal nutrition. We know that not getting enough iron or B12 can impair brain development. And then there's this really powerful psychological factor called stereotype threat. This is a well-documented thing where if you're a member of a group with a negative stereotype about its intelligence, the sheer pressure of not wanting to confirm that stereotype can directly and immediately lower your score on a test.
So, this brings us to part 4. To really get to the truth here, we have to carefully deconstruct some of the core scientific ideas that are so often misunderstood and frankly misused in this whole debate.
First, and this one is absolutely critical, we have to talk about the concept of race itself. The modern scientific consensus is overwhelming on this. Race is a social and political idea, not a clean biological category. I mean, geneticists have shown again and again that there's more genetic variation within any so-called racial group than there is between them. That simple fact just completely undermines any argument that's based on distinct racial biology.
Next up is maybe the single most misunderstood word in this entire conversation, heritability. Now, it sounds like inherited, right? But it means something super specific. It's a statistic that only tells you how much of the differences within a single group of people can be chalked up to their genes in their specific environment. It's a measure of variation, not a measure of destiny.
And this right here leads to the single biggest mistake people make in this debate, the heritability fallacy. I want you to think of it like this. Imagine you have 2 fields of plants. In one field with really rich soil, the differences in height between the plants are mostly due to their genes. That's high within-group heritability. But that tells you absolutely nothing about why all the plants in a second field with poor soil are shorter. The difference between the 2 fields is 100% environmental. It's the exact same logic with people. High heritability within a group tells you nothing about what causes average differences between groups.
So let's just nail this down. Heritability is about the differences within one group. Genetic determination is that popular but wrong idea that your genes lock in a trait. And even our most advanced genetic tools, these things called polygenic scores, well, they totally fall apart when you try to use them for this. They're just notoriously unreliable when you apply data from one ancestry group to another.
In fact, let's put a hard number on that problem. The vast majority of genetic data we have comes from people of European ancestry. So when you build a polygenic score for cognition using that data and then try to apply it to people of African ancestry, its ability to predict anything drops by a staggering 78%. Our best genetic tools today are simply not built to make these kinds of cross-ancestral comparisons. It just doesn't work.
So after all that history, all that data, all that science, where do we actually land? Let's turn to our final section, the scientific consensus today, and where we go from here.
So, what does the leading professional organization, the American Psychological Association, have to say? Well, their conclusion is totally unambiguous. Based on all the available evidence, they've concluded that genetics does not explain the observed differences in IQ test performance between groups. They state it plainly. The idea that there are genetically determined intelligence differences between races is scientifically false.
So, the bottom line from all this science and history is crystal clear. The IQ gap is a product of accumulated environmental disadvantages, things like nutrition, healthcare, socioeconomic status, and systemic bias. It's not a product of innate genetic differences.
And all of this leaves us with one last vital question. Because once we accept that intelligence isn't some fixed thing that's locked in by our genes, but instead is shaped and limited by the world around us, the entire debate shifts. It stops being a question of if we can change things, and it becomes a question of how. So how do we build environments that remove those constraints and allow every single person to flourish? That is the real challenge this science leaves us with.